eventually. Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 2, which is going to be on the first Afghan war between 1838
Oh, I'm Jake. I'm Jake.
Sorry for the boomerism. Sorry for the... Hang on. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, good. All right. Sorry for the boomerisms there, guys. Okay. As always, give people time to get in. I'm going to start us with a bit of a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, a loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly profit laurel, the easy young grudge praise. Come down to search your manhood through all the thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all the thankless years.
That was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do go and check out his YouTube channel if you like good music from a proper right of center musician. Okay, I am very conscious that the second of our streams, like the first one, is going to be about a British disaster. I do promise you, gents, that next week's won't be. It'll be about a British victory of some description. So, yeah.
we can blame me, ING, because the reason we're doing this is because I suggested it. Because recently, I've been. I did a stream last night of Apostolic Majesty on the Great Game, in which the First Afghan War was an episode in that period. And so, because I was reading about it and ING did the series, I suggested it because I thought it was interesting. And as people can see,
it is Hitman, which is why I agreed to do it. And also, I do recommend people to go and check out Hitman's YouTube channel. It's called Hitman, and there will be a link in it later on in a pinned comment. He did an excellent stream with Apostolic Majesty on the Great Game overall, and you could describe the First Afghan War, I suppose, as the first military move within the Great Game. I think that would be fair enough, don't you think, Hitman?
Or maybe the first British military move, but the Russians were already encroaching on Persia earlier in the Great Game. So
true.
And
yeah, the first British military move.
People are wondering, I'm not using my normal avatar. As we're talking about the First Afghan War, I'm tonight the role of Stout Scott Alexander Burns, Bukhara Burns, as he was known, but
Secunda Burns was the other thing.
I should change my profile to that Lithuanian Russian, well, quote unquote Russian diplomat. What was his name again?
Do you mean Captain? Oh yeah, he was the ambassador to Dost Mohammed. Yeah.
Yes, that's what in the Cossack uniform. Yes,
that's right. That's right. They had dinner together in Kabul, I do believe.
Yes,
Indeed.
Yes,
and he ended up, when he went back to St. Petersburg, he ended up killing himself, I do believe.
Yeah, he was. Was he disowned by the Russian state or something?
Not totally, but it was. I mean, to start this off a little bit, obviously Britain invaded Afghanistan, short version, because we were worried that the Russians might do the same from their side. Although at that time, in 1838, the Russians didn't actually border Afghanistan. They were some way off it yet. There were still some independent khanates in between the Russians and Afghanistan. It was basically the British were fearful that the Afghans might get influence there. And this Russian envoy that was sent to Kabul was really the last straw for the Brits. And particularly for the Governor General of India, which of course at that time was still run by the British East India Company.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to add a bit more context. So, yes, ultimately, the Russians, I think, were just wanting to put as much pressure on Britain as they could. And it's probably worth just going over a bit of the background. So I've mentioned Alexander Burns. Well, he's quite, he's a young officer in his career, and he makes a name for himself. His very first sort of mission is that he goes on a diplomatic visit to Ranjit Singh, who was the Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, which is Britain's main key ally in northwestern India, sort of a buffer state between Afghanistan and the British territories. And so he gives this sort of wonderful gift of these great 4 Shire horses to Ranjit Singh, and he's there basically just to try and shore up this alliance, because Ranjit Singh and Dost Mohammed, the Emir of Afghanistan, are rivals because the Sikhs had taken territory that had been Afghan. So this is a Peshawar, which is a Pashtun.
Yeah, they'd just taken Peshawar, which became quite famous on the northwest frontier of India eventually.
Indeed, it's part of modern-day Pakistan, and it's largely populated by Pashtuns, which are the dominant ethnic group of Afghanistan. And this would be a sore point between the two states. And Burns, after this mission, is then sent off to Bukhara to try and establish an alliance there as well to keep out the Russians. And then he he then comes to do 2 visits to Dost Muhammad. The first one, again, is to try and secure an alliance, which works relatively well in terms of establishing relationships and trade. Ultimately, Burns comes to believe that Dost Muhammad is the best bet for a ruler of the united, secure Afghanistan. Because at the time, in the western city of Herat, you will have the emir, who is of the Durrani dynasty, which had been the dynasty that ruled Afghanistan from the mid-18th century, founded by Ahmad Shah Durrani, one of the generals of Nader Shah, probably the last great Asiatic conqueror. And the Durranis, in fact, invade India several times in the 18th century. And it's interesting because at this point, Herat was actually under siege by the Persians because they wanted to try and reincorporate it into their empire. And again, another Russian maneuver because Simenovich, who was the Russian consul in Tehran, was actually there observing the siege. So the Russians couldn't have kept their ambitions any more secret. But the British stopped that by sending a fleet up the Persian Gulf to Bushehr and capturing it, and then the Iranians caved. But then, so considering all these Russian maneuvers, along with Katkin Vitkovich, because Vitkovich goes after Burns' second visit, where at this point the Governor General of India, whose name escapes me, he decided that, okay, we can get an alliance with Dost Muhammad.
Ellenborough hitman, I believe.
Oh, thank you, Ellenborough. So because Dost Muhammad is still trying to angle for the return of Peshawar, Ellenborough says no, he's not getting Peshawar back. End of story. And he takes our alliance or leaves it. And so Burns goes back knowing this is not going to go down like a bucket of cold sick. And despite the good relation and rapport he's built up with Dost Muhammad, the talks fall through and Burns has to leave. And then that's when Vitkovich comes in. And Dost Muhammad is like, yeah, I'll go.
I beg your pardon. It was actually Lord Auckland. I'm sorry, Edmund.
Well, Edinburgh was.
Ellenborough took over later. Ellenborough took over after Auckland. Yeah, I beg your pardon. It's my fault.
Yeah, I think it was Lord Auckland issued the Shimla Declaration, which was the declaration of court or the casus belli for attacking Dost Muhammad. So
this is the same Auckland that Auckland in New Zealand is named after, by the way.
Yeah, I'd wondered that.
He was First Lord of the Aberley several times, which is how come Auckland ended up getting named after it.
Right. Well, obviously, when Vitkovich turns up at that point, Lord Auckland is like, well, fuck this. We need to get rid of Dost Muhammad if he's going to pull maneuvers like this. And the original plan was to actually get Ranjit Singh and the Sikhs to do the job, but Ranjit Singh very wisely bows out. I love AM's reasoning, which he said last night. Well, if the Sikhs move in, the British would have been like, oh, great, we can now just annex the Sikhs when they're busy fighting the Afghans for us. And,
well, not to get ahead of ourselves, at some point we will do a stream on the Sikh Wars, and there were 2, which were probably the toughest battles the British ever fought in India. But and the Sikhs actually had very well-trained infantry, trained by European officers, mainly French, Italian, and American. They had very good, well-trained infantry, and they actually had more and heavier artillery than the Brits did.
It's also...
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I was just saying, it's also worth mentioning that at this time, the Sikh Empire, only 10% of the population, so in their region in modern day northern India, Pakistan, the Punjab, was actually Sikh. I think 80% was Muslim and the rest were Hindu. So this was the thing. They were definitely a minority that were ruling over this vast bit of northern India.
And if people want to know who the Sikhs were, I think the best easy description of the Sikhs is that they were rather like Puritan Hindus. I think that's probably the closest you'll get to it.
Well, Sikhism is quite hard to describe. It's in some aspects, it's more of a way of life than necessarily a like a religious denomination.
But they started off as extremist and purified Hindus. Is how they started, and very military, very militaristic.
It's quite interesting because as we'll be talking through this, there is a long history of Islamic, like whether it's the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughals or the, there's a long history of Islamic rulers breaking through the Indus Valley into India and ruling over most of India, probably exceptions with a few southern kingdoms, but there always was this constant arrival of these Islamic warlords who would form, the vast territories over over northern India. And during this time, you did have several, I guess you could say, like sects or quasi-religious groups where there was this attempt to blend aspects of Islam and aspects of Hinduism into each other.
Yes, Akbar the Great had this like weird syncretic religion that he tried to implement, and it's really strange because it was like this like esoteric kind of organization that only he and members of like the cabinet could be. So there was only like 30 members at one point. It was a bit like an Indian version of like a monastic sect, but knightly order as well. It was really, really interesting. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Just to answer Davey in the chat, the history chap has a good knowledge of British in India. Yes, he does. I think the channels I would recommend for that sort of stuff are the history chap, but also Redcoat History is an excellent channel that covers some of this. And also British Muzzle Loaders has some stuff on this as well. So they'd probably be the 3 YouTube channels I would suggest people go check out. Also, Aaron Hook, who sadly wasn't able to join us this evening because he's got family commitments, is talking about Flashman novels. And there are 2 really good Flashman novels that are set in India. And one of them is Flashman and the Mountain of Light, which is actually about the Sikh Wars. And I think the first one, is it the first one, Flashman? But an early one is him in Afghanistan. Is him in this war we're talking about this evening, which is where he gets his undeserved reputation for bravery and all this kind of stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I've never read the Flashman novel, sadly. The closest
they're really good.
Yeah.
They're really good because although they're very funny, the actual history bits are extremely accurate.
Is that the same one where I see like the cover art for it on Twitter every now and then, where you have the British officer posing
with
like
a cute
this
Indian girl? Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
lusting over him. Yeah, holding onto his leg. Yeah.
Yep.
That's
the Flashman is supposed to be a great womanizer. That's one of the things that is one of his defining things. But he's also a bit of a coward who gets this undeserved reputation for bravery. They're very funny, but all of the historical bits of those novels are really accurate, and the biographical sketches of the real people in them are also pretty accurate too.
And what I love is I don't know if you noticed, but Dan Tubb of the Lotus Eaters, his avatar is literally, I think, for he and his wife's anniversary, they actually had like custom art done of the Flashman novel with Dan as Flashman, and that's what his avatar is.
Yep. I've seen a couple of people who have Flashman avatars, but yeah, that's true. Davey is saying British Muzzle Loaders is more concerned with South Africa. He does a lot of South African stuff, but he does cover other stuff. He's got loads of stuff on the Peninsular War, for example, Redcoat History. He's also got some stuff on India as well. And British Muzzle Loaders is actually not much about Canada. He does cover Canadian stuff, but most of his stuff is about British Army stuff. He's got an excellent series on the Battle of Inkerman, for example, in the Crimean War. He's also covered Afghanistan in terms of the Second Afghan War, which is something we will do at another stage. He's covered that quite extensively. So yeah, most of British muzzle loaders is not about Canada, even though Rob, the excellent dude who runs it, is a Canadian of Scottish heritage. But anyway, leaving all that aside, Hitman, would you like to finish off your saying the scene stuff, and then I'll put a map up for people.
Well, that was it really. Lord Auckland is like, right, we're going to invade. So he assembles a 15,000 strong Anglo-Indian force led by General Elphinstone. He appoints a fellow called MacNarton to be the British sort of emissary to Shah Shuja, who he's also of the Durrani dynasty, and he was actually the former ruler of Afghanistan before he was deposed by Dost Muhammad. So they're just putting.
And he was a pensioner of the British. The British were keeping him on a pension in case they ever needed him.
The British do this a lot. They give like subsidies to these various puppet rulers to make sure that they're loyal and such.
Yeah, basically the Maharaja sort of system in place in India.
Certainly,
also true.
Yes, they assemble this army. They also attach Burns here as the political aide to MacNarton.
And MacNarton was simply known as the envoy by everybody, including the Afghans, and he was kind of the top British diplomat with the expedition.
And but despite Burns being a bit of an expert, MacNarton just kind of ignored his advice, which is one of the reasons this ended up being such a shit show.
Yeah, absolutely true. Just to explain to people, Burns, the guy who's the avatar of Hitman this evening, he was what was called a political officer. Young officers in the Honourable East India Company in those days, and later on in the Anglo-Indian Army, could choose to take a political track, which would lead them into dealing with the local tribesmen, Rajas and emirs and all these sorts of people, and that's what Burns had done.
Yeah, because he's also referred to as like obviously like agent and sort of like the similar to the system that was in North America, where each tribe, native tribe, had like a British these British agents or to sort of get tribes on sides and everything. And if we ever do the 1812, we will also see that was in place. I think the Hudson Bay Company, well, again, because very similar, like the Hudson Bay, the East India Company was also a similar.
The Hudson Bay Company and the British India, the British East India Company were somewhat similar. They were both crown.
Like crown limited companies, sort of.
Yes,
by
they
the crown.
were. They weren't owned. They weren't at all owned by the British monarch, but they were official, if you know what I mean. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. And of course, the Honourable East India Company, I think this is worth going into a bit before we start. It had its own army in India, based on the three presidencies: Bombay, Madras, and what was the other one? Can't even remember now. There were three presidents.
There wasn't it Calcutta as well?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it was. But the Honourable East India Company had its own army. They were mostly Indian soldiers with British officers and a few British NCOs. Although the Indian infantry soldiers were called sepoys, and the Indian cavalry soldiers were called sowars. And most of the Honourable East India Company's army was Indian soldiers, but with British officers and a handful of British NCOs. But every presidency army also had one white British regiment as well, all of which were put into the British Army after the Indian Mutiny.
And wasn't there some friction between British officers and officers in the East India Company, that British officers would sort of look down
A little bit, yeah. The three presidency armies were Bengal, Bombay, and Madras, of which the Bengal army was regarded as the best and the Madras army the worst because it was in the south of India and didn't really see as much action for the most part. And yes, there was the Queen's Regiment officers, as they were known, because they were the British Army officers, and the British Army did serve in India. So there were Queen's Regiment, British regiments, in other words, in India that would support the East India Company in its wars, but they weren't part of the East India Company army, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I remember I think it's one of Sharp. It might be in the TV series, but I think it was also in the books. There was it? One of the officers said, "There's too many Scots, too many Irish," just sort of complaining about the state of the officer corps.
Which would be crazy because the British Army itself had very large numbers of Scottish officers, and of course, the nearest the British ever got to the Prussian Junker class was Protestant Irish officers. They were the closest we ever came to a Junker class. You know, you look at famous British Army officers, and you'll find a hell of a lot of them were Protestants from Ireland.
Were they like just Anglo-Irish or like
Anglo-Irish in the same way that Wellington was?
Yeah.
They didn't really consider themselves Irish for the most part, but they were born in Ireland. Yeah.
Okay.
But that was the nearest Britain ever came to a Junker class, to be quite honest. So very common, but that wasn't the disagreement between the Queen's officers and the East India Company officers, the John Company officers. John Company was the common term for it. It was that they came from different backgrounds, and like the John Company officers all went to Addiscombe, which was the East India Company's own officer training place, a bit like Sandhurst in Britain, and just like the British Army. It tended to be a family affair, so sons would follow their father into the East India Company army. And of course, the British East India Company officers were expected to learn the local lingo. You couldn't be an officer in a Bengal or any other presidency army in India unless you could speak the language of your troops. So they had to learn that.
Yeah, a funny story is when my grandfather was sent to India, he almost failed because he had to learn the language even under the Raj, and he barely passed the assessments on that. He was he barely passed the language because he struggled with the Hindi and the sort of getting basic grip of the Hindi language.
Yeah. Later on, what happened after the Indian Mutiny, when the British government took over India, officers who were trying to get into the Indian Army, and you had to get higher scores to get into the Indian Army than the British Army in the Raj period. So after 1857, what used to happen in those days is they would spend a year when they first went out to India with a British regiment in India to learn the military side of what they were doing. And then they would go off to their Indian or Gurkha regiment or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But that was later on. And that, not totally, but to a large extent, got rid of the problems between the British and Indian officers.
Because you mentioned this idea of father and son. Well, it's very interesting because one officer that does serve with distinction in the First War is Lieutenant Henry Durand, who was an engineer lieutenant, and he's the father of Mortimer Durand, who was a diplomat who came later and whose namesake is the Durand Line, the modern boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Yep.
And during the Durand, during the Anglo-Afghan War, he was known for, didn't he blow up the gates of...
Yes, he blew up the gate of the fortress of Ghazni because
Ghazni, yeah.
When they invade, the Ranjit Singh won't allow the British to come via his territory, so Britain has to like wheel round to Sindh up into Afghanistan, and then once they're in, they take Kandahar first, which they take without firing a shot. Then they start marching north to the great fortress of Ghazni, and the British are worried that they're not going to be able to break in, and because of how massive the fortifications of Ghazni were.
And they'd left their siege guns behind. Hitman is another thing worth mentioning.
Yes, what they end up having to do is because the wall, most of the walls were actually like double fortified, where even though there was like a gate entrance inside, they'd actually bricked it up from the inside as well. There's only one entrance, which Lieutenant Henry Durand finds, and he has to take a very risky decision to like quickly like get in there with the explosives and manually set it off, which is
they have to charge into this gate under fire, and they've got big bags of black powder, basically gunpowder, with them. And then they have to charge into this gate, light the fuse, and then run off before it explodes. Very, very brave.
But
Yeah, that was under Sir John Keane leading that siege in the Battle of Ghazni.
It's worth. There's a map on the screen now, gents, so you can follow where we're talking about within Afghanistan. It's a modern map, but it marks places like Jalalabad, Kabul, and crikey, what's the other
Ghazni.
third town? Ghazni, but also hang on, what is this place called? I have to remember now.
So people
Kandahar. Kandahar, sorry, Kandahar. And Kandahar, of course, was the place where the British Army was based around in the very recent, for Britain, fourth Afghan War. So
yeah, and also Helmand as well. You see next to Kandahar, you have Helmand Province as well. Which
that was where most of the British troops spent their time for no purpose other than getting killed and maimed for 20 years. But
yeah, and then if you look to the more western provinces there, you see Herat up in the northwest. Now, back then, that Herat, what is Herat and below, was all claimed by the Persians, because historically that was Persian territory.
Yep. It was. But it's worth pointing out a couple of things before we move on. These British forces that invaded Afghanistan, one of them had about 4,500 troops, and the other one had about 6,500 troops. But both of them had something like 10 or 12,000 camp followers, baggage wagons, camels, you name it. And this is why the British left the siege guns behind that would have been very handy when they got to this town that Hitman was talking about. But they were left behind just because the British had so much baggage, and there were almost no roads in Afghanistan.
No, and so it's worth noting that once they blow up the gate of Ghazni, the British charge in, and there's a vicious fight, and eventually the Afghans withdraw. And amazingly, we take that fort with very light casualties, because when we were going into it, because of how big the fortifications were, we were thinking this is going to be a bloodbath. But mercifully, because we blew up the right point of the wall, we were able to get in with minimal bloodshed.
Yeah, the Brits lost about 200 killed and wounded, and the Afghans lost about 550, I believe, is the figures.
But then after we take Ghazni, we then march north to take Kabul, which again we take without much resistance. But something that's important is at this point on the march to Kabul, some captured Afghans, Shah Shuja, Britain's candidate, goes a bit sadistic and starts like having them like tortured and executed, and this just basically disgusts all the British officers, and you're thinking, oh great, we've got to support this vile head on the throne of Afghanistan now.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that Shuja had about 6,000 mercenaries that he and the Brits had paid for from India. They were Indians that he'd taken with him, and they weren't worth a light, frankly. But they were good at murdering civilians, but not much else.
Hitman is quite interesting because obviously and this, like the more recent Afghan one, I a few years ago I met with a veteran from the more recent one, and just to cut sort of comparison short here, he was basically saying that the Brits he would regularly, and this would be regularly, work with the Afghan National Army, but they'd be from a certain tribe, and basically what they would do is just engage in like ethnic tribal conflict. So they would just target their rivals, the rival tribes, whether they were Taliban or not. And the funny thing is, this is exactly what sort of happened here, in the sense of there was obviously some sort of tribal element, and then this is the problem with this is the problem that the British Army would continually face with Afghanistan, is making realizing thinking that they can use the tribes when in fact the tribes end up just sort of using them.
No, you did mention that to me before. I think it's when we were talking about clips from was it The Power of Nightmares by Adam Curtis?
Yeah, as well, yeah, and because that was the first time when he spoke to me, and I saw it later on. It reminded me of effectively in Helmand, what they would do is they would, as soon as after the invasion, in 2001, the the Allied forces would say, well, we want to capture Al Qaeda, and Taliban fighters. So what this confederation of tribes on the British and American side would do is they would just go around kidnapping rival tribal members and presenting them and say, oh yeah, he's Al Qaeda, he's Taliban. And then the rival tribes would do the exact same to get, because they realized they could get money from this. And so it was basically just a massive grift operation of kidnapping each other. But in doing so, all the tribes realized that this was solely down to the British and American forces, and it just alienated Britain and America. And as a result, because again, the Taliban itself isn't from Afghanistan; they're from Pakistan. They are a sect, a school of thought that was formed in Pakistan, and because of the chaos and
very true, guys. Could I just say, look, I'm happy to do.
Sorry, we'll keep it to the first Afghan war, yeah, but yeah,
I'm happy to do a comparison at the end of the stream with the more recent stuff. But let's do that at the end of the stream, because otherwise we're not going to get very far. So Hitman has just described how basically Kabul was occupied without a fight. And this was a bad thing from the British point of view, because the Brits do what the British politicians in India did what all British politicians do as soon as they get the possible chance to do so. Once the army had got to Kabul and occupied it, they reduced the forces. Like quite a lot of the troops who had invaded Afghanistan, and like I said, there was only about 11,000 actual fighting men at the start, but that was quite rapidly reduced to about half that number. Hitman, carry on.
Yes, and so what happens is Dost Muhammad flees off into the wilderness. Shah Shuja is declared the emir, and he's put up in the Bala Hisar, the main palace in Kabul. However, the palace is actually very fortified. It's basically a castle. The issue is that the British, instead of putting their troops inside the Bala Hisar, they build these cantonments outside in the plains outside the city. And
a cantonment, for people in the chat, is kind of like a barracks, basically, but a fortified barracks. Sorry, Hitman, carry on.
No, that's fine. And but then also officers like Burns go around and just take large wealthy properties for themselves. And one thing Burns was infamous for that really annoyed them is that he was a bit of a womanizer, and let's just say he had a bit of a time stealer sexual appetite.
Yes, he did. We were talking about this before the stream. Let me just explain one other thing. This cantonment that the British put up, which was fortified, but it was in a very bad place. It was overlooked all around by hills, which any soldier will tell you is a very bad idea, particularly when you're facing an enemy like the Afghans, who are well known for sniping. but also even worse than that, the main supply depot was placed outside the cantonment. Like, if you really want to make yourselves weak, do this sort of thing, you know. Why? I just don't understand. I mean, as Hitman correctly said, the correct thing for the Brits to do would have been to occupy the Bala-Hissa, which was almost impregnable to the Afghans, who had very little artillery and this kind of stuff, you know. So, in fact, the Afghans didn't really have an army. It was all pretty much tribal levies of various descriptions, and they did have one advantage. The Afghans in the late 1830s and early 1840s were armed with a thing called a jazail, which was a smoothbore musket, but it was much longer than the British Brown Bess, and because it was longer, it was a bit more accurate over longer distances.
Yes, and there's a lot of pot shots being taken.
I do think the mistake made by the British force, especially the withdrawal of 8,000 during the sort of occupation period, was really down to this idea that they still thought this was just them acquiring another, you know, province or another state within the Indian subcontinent, and sort of treating the Afghans as just another sort of Indian group of people. Because we're honest, the Indians, even after conflict, remain quite passive. You know, the Indians as a group can be, you know, after these conflicts, remain quite passive. But the reality is that, you know, the Afghan people, the people of the Hindu Kush and the region around modern day Afghanistan, were just anything but. And you know, again, as I stated, this is the sort of territory where these great Islamic empires would form and descend upon India, you know, in conquests or significant raids. And so I think they sort of underestimated the type of people who were living there at the time.
I think it's also worth mentioning that, of course, Alexander the Great had gone through Afghanistan in the ancient era, and as a result of that, to this day, you still get blue-eyed Afghans occasionally.
And just going back to what you said about Great Conquerors AI, but in fact, there's two before the Duranis. There's two actually very famous dynasties that come out of Afghanistan in the medieval period. You have Mahmud of Ghazni forming the Ghaznavid Empire, and later you've got Muhammad of Gur forming the Ghurids, which were the antecedents to the Delhi Sultanate. So certainly it's a bit of a running theme.
Anyway, I think that's to just firm up the position a bit. The Brits are occupying Kabul, they're occupying Kandahar, and they're also occupying Jalalabad, which is on this map, which is on the route back to the Khyber Pass into India, or actually to the Sikh kingdom of the Punjab at that stage. But yeah, anyway, they're occupying these three seas, but they're not occupying a great deal else. And so...
So Dost Muhammad is basically able to organise a lot of these tribal levies to then sort of start pushing in. And what does end up happening is that he is captured and then taken off to India as a prisoner, but his son, Muhammad Akbar, is the one really leading the resistance. And the thing is, when Britain took Kabul, they were actually hoping to just leave and let Shah Shuja with his own mercenaries sort of rule the country. The problem is, because he's so unpopular and not really respected, he's
hated, I think, would be the most accurate way to describe him.
Yeah, and so there's no one loyal to him, so Britain has to keep troops there to make sure he's not deposed immediately. And
but we don't keep many. But we don't keep many.
No. And
I think the Kabul garrison ends up being one British regiment, the 44th Foot, which is the East Essex Regiment, or was the East Essex Regiment when we still had an army, and a couple of sepoy battalions, Indian infantry. I think there was one Indian light cavalry unit and a few guns, not many. That was the fighting force that was in Kabul, which is the capital, for God's sake.
And so it's from this point that basically, because the mullahs start railing against British, especially Burns' sexual escapades, and what ends up happening is let me just see if I can get the exact date right. I believe this would have been in 1841. Hang on, I'm just trying to see if I can get the exact date.
While you're doing that, Hitman, I'll just say to people, one of the final straws was one of the leading Afghans' slave girls ran away because Afghan was a slave state. And one of their slave girls ran away to Secunda Burns, the guy who's Hitman's using as his avatar this evening. And Burns not only took her in, but slept with her. So, yeah.
Yeah, so sorry. So it's on the 2nd of November, 1841. This author had been occupying Kabul for a couple of years. There's a large delegation of angry Afghans organised outside Burns, the house Burns is occupying. And
because of the thing that started this was this leading Afghan slave girl running away, Burns taking her in and then sleeping with her. Yeah.
Wasn't it also? Sorry to interject, but wasn't it also there had been rumours that, or there been claims as well, that British soldiers and officers stationed in Kabul
had been sleeping with Afghan women? Yes,
Afghan women as well in general, which sort of just enraged the Afghan population.
Oh, look, we were saying before you joined us, we were saying the British Army saying about the Pashtuns, which is the Pathans, in the Northwest Frontier, who are the major people in Afghanistan as well. The British Army saying about these people was they took a woman for duty, a boy for pleasure, and a goat for ecstasy. And yes, I'm quite sure that some British soldiers took advantage of that. But it didn't make the British popular with the Afghans, that's for sure.
No. And yeah, so this mob starts protesting outside Burns' house. So he has to come out onto like the veranda and address them and try and calm them down. And while this is going on, basically Elphinstone and McNarton are arguing over what to do. And like Elphinston's like, no, we can't send the troops in. That's going to cause a problem. And then the younger officers are saying, no, we need to send men now to disperse this before it gets out of hand.
You've got to be decisive. You've got to be decisive. And Elphinston, who had such bad gout, he couldn't even ride a horse. He had to go around in a carriage. This was the bloke we'd left in charge of probably the most difficult job in the British Empire in 1841, 1842. So, okay.
No, certainly. And so as this is happening, the crowd gets larger and is getting more and more riotous. And the thing is as well, the British make the very sensible idea of putting their local gold and money supply in the building next to where Burns is. And so the Afghans then decide to set fire to the treasury and Burns' house and storm the building. And so he and the what few men are inside valiantly fight off this horde of Afghans. But unfortunately, Burns tries to sneak out the building, and it's believed that he possibly may have been betrayed by an Afghan guide. And when he goes out, he's immediately called out that there's Burns, and then they will just jump on and stab him to death, basically.
Yeah, to be fair to Burns, it is said he killed 5 Afghans before he was killed himself. But yes.
Indeed.
Did the mob actually catch him in the act with these Afghan women as well?
No.
They weren't. Like, he wasn't like spending. They weren't with them during this incident. No.
No, he had a guard of about 25 Indian sepoy soldiers. They were all killed. All the women and children in Burns's house were also killed. Everyone was killed. They didn't even spare children. The Afghans killed everybody.
Yeah, and then obviously looted all the treasure from the building next door. And to make this even worse, Shah Shuja, as he's the ruler, decides he's going to send his Indian mercenaries to come and deal with this mob that's killed Alexander Burns and burnt these buildings down. And the McNarton and Elphinstone are like, okay, yeah, let him deal with it. And then his little ragtag army turns up and shits their pants and runs away, and they can't deal with the Afghans, and that's where things really.
And half of them are killed as well. Hitman. Half of these guys are killed.
I've actually is it all right if I could read an excerpt from a diary from Lady Sale that actually talked
Yes,
about
of course you can. Yeah, Lady
of,
Sale's book is one of the books I've read on Afghanistan, so go
so
for it, mate.
this is excerpt. So this is what happened on the day. Now this is from her perspective, I guess, at large in Kabul.
Just before you go on, AI, just to say, Lady Sale was the wife of a British general and one of the better British generals in Afghanistan. So carry on.
So she writes on the 2nd November 1841, this morning early, all was in commotion in Kabul. The shops were plundered and the people all fighting. The same day, a mob thirsty for blood appeared outside the house of the East India Company's second political officer, Sir Alexander Skendar Burns, where Burns ordered his
Secunda Burns.
Secunda Burns,
Yeah.
where Burns ordered his sepoy guards not to fire while he stood outside haranguing the mob in Pashto, attempting unconvincingly to persuade the assembled men that he did not bed their daughters and sisters. Captain William Broadfoot, who was with Burns, saw the mob march forward, leading him to open fire with another officer, writing in his diary that he killed 5 or 6 men with his own hand before he was shot down. The mob smashed into Burns's house, where he, his brother Charles, their wives and children, several aides, and the sepoys were all torn to pieces. The mob then attacked the home of the paymaster Johnston, who was not present, leading to later write that when he surveyed the remains of his house, that they gained possessions of my treasury by undermining the wall. They murdered the whole of the guard, 1 officer, and 28 sepoys, all my servants, male, female, and children, plundered the treasury, burnt all my office records, and possessed themselves of all my private property.
Yeah,
The
absolutely
the British forces took no action in response, despite being only 5 minutes away, which encouraged further revolt.
This was Elphinstone, Elfie Bay, as everyone called him, which was a bit of a piss take. He was completely indecisive. I'm going to ask this question of Hitman because Hitman is our Orientalist. Aubrey Alley says, I don't understand how the Afghans are so interested in boys, yet they're of the Muslim faith. Don't they kill gay people? Is that a dumb question? Hitman, you're the Orientalist. Perhaps you can answer that.
Well, regarding the Afghans, I can't say specifically. What I will say is I was chatting with Hunger, my American Lebanese friend, about this once, and he has a take on this regarding the Arabs, because there's a very similar problem in that ethnic group, especially the Peninsula Arabs, the Saudis, because again they love a bit of sodomy, unfortunately. And what he said is that I can't see this being that different from Afghanistan, because they're both Muslim cultures. Basically, what you'll notice is that the more conservative Muslim country you get, the more sodomy there is. And conversely, the more secular it is, the less sodomy there is, which seems like a really interesting contrast. And his theory is that basically, because in Saudi Arabia, they're very patriarchal, women, used to not be able to drive. They have to be accompanied by men everywhere, because if a woman's not accompanied, she could be hypothetically be sexually assaulted or raped by any other man. And if that happens under, Arab tribal customs, you have to then get vengeance and murder them for such a transgression. And obviously that can get out of hand, and you get bloody huge blood feuds. And then there's this argument that basically being a man is so high stress because you've got to worry about this shit all the time, that you kind of take comfort in male companions, essentially. And that was sort of Hunger's rationale for it. And so considering, Afghanistan's also a very Islamic tribal society, it's probably not a million miles away from the truth.
So to answer Aubrey as well, the practice that is called Bachi, Bachi Bazi, which it basically just means it's Pashto for, like, I think the word boy play. That's the sort of translation
Uh-huh.
of what it comes to. Now, the origins of it is around about the 12th. I mean, I think it's the 12th century. From what I from what, because I looked up this some time ago when I was first told about this, when because again British troops had to listen to a lot of Afghan National Army people engaging with this, and had to sort of stand by 'em.
Again, AI. We will come to this at the end of the stream, mate.
Yeah, we'll get on to this, but it seems to me though because Afghanistan was, even back at, from at this time in the 19th century, but even back into the the 12th 13th century, just a pure slave state. It is like it has its origins in like uh sexual, the use of slaves in this act seems to be the origin as well. So there is, as Hitman says, it is um it's hard to explain, but I think what
I
it
mean,
was,
look. Let's be clear. I mean, Islam says in its holy books that you may do what you like with what your left hand possesses, which in other words is sex slaves. They say that. It's in the Quran, boys. So,
We can get into, the whole idea of.
I mean, that's even got something to do with the so-called UK grooming gangs. But again, we'll come back to this modern stuff at the end of the stream, because otherwise we'll never get the history bit done. Loafer Sheffield in the chat. Look, hang on, guys. Loafer Sheffield in the chat says sodomy in the lash, but no rum. Loafer Sheffield, that's a Winston Churchill saying about the Royal Navy, and what Winston Churchill knew about the Royal Navy is not worth knowing. But that's just me pointing that out. All right, sorry guys. Let's get back to the history bit.
Sorry, yeah. So, after this is disbanded, is at this point that Muhammad Akbar turns up with his tribal levies, and the what ends up happening is all the military in Kabul retreat into the cantonment, leaving Shah Shuja and the Bala Hissar to hold up. And it's at this point that where Akbar turns up, he's managed to get his hands on some artillery, and he puts them on these hills surrounding the cantonment. So it literally was the worst position ever. You don't put it inside the city, you put it outside, and there's all these highland around it, which the Afghans can then entrench themselves on top of with their artillery to shoot down, and they literally fire cannons into the cantonment. So it's a complete bedlam.
And Elphinstone at this stage does send out a British force to try and chuck them off a hill, but he sent one artillery gun. And the Royal Artillery had a thing that you never sent one gun anywhere, because if anything happened to that gun, you got no artillery left. You always send at least two. But Elphinstone was such a twat, he sent one. The gun did jam or something happened to it, couldn't be used. The attack didn't work.
Lady Sale also... sorry, Hitman, go ahead.
Because what ends up happening, I think the gun overheats, and so they have to wait for it to cool down. But then the Afghans come up with their Jazales, and they start sniping the members of the gun, and then it's knocked out that way.
Yeah, and that's why you don't send one gun anyway. You always send two. But anyway, never mind. Thus Wanderlust asks, have I read that William Dalrymple's book on this? Yes, I have. Is that the Signal Disaster one? I think that's the one you mean. Anyway, carry on.
So Elphinstone sent Captain Sturt to the to the Bala Hissar to see if it's possible to recover control of the city. That same afternoon, and Lady Sale writes in her diary. This is another excerpt that I have from this. Just as he entered the precincts of the palace, so that's the Bala Hissar, he was stabbed in three places. So I think she's referring to Captain Sturt, by a young man well dressed who escaped into a building close by, where he was protected by the by gates being shut. And so this is Captain Sturt, who was sent to basically recover control of the city. And I think Lady Sale cared, sort of took care of him, along with Captain Sturt's wife, where Lady Sale also noted that he was covered in blood issuing from his mouth and was unable to articulate or pass on any information of what was going on out there, which makes sense because he was stabbed 3 times.
Yeah.
I think he was only, apparently according to Lady Sale, he was only able to utter one word, which was better. So that wasn't much.
Hours later.
Yeah, hours later.
Yeah, and so what you have here is you have a British general who's not prepared to really do anything. You've got the envoy Macnaghten, and the envoy Macnaghten decides, or actually is lured into a meeting with these people. Would you say that was correct, Hitman?
Well, what happens at this point is Macnaghten decides to negotiate with Muhammad Akbar, and at this point they decide, okay, we'll leave Afghanistan and we'll take Shah Shuja with us, and that's the deal. However, what Macnaghten tries to do is he tries to negotiate with some of the other tribal leaders behind Muhammad Akbar's back, and then on the 23rd of December, where Macnaghten is invited to a meeting with Akbar, and so they meet out on the grassy plain, and he's invited to sit down for like a meeting, and then suddenly a load of men spring up out of nowhere at a signal and seize Macnaghten and
three other officers who were with him.
Yep. And Akbar reveals to the tribal leaders that Macnaghten's been trying to do, like, screw them over basically, and then he's then dragged off and he's dismembered. He's cut off into all his legs and arms are chopped off, and he's displayed in the bazaar in Kabul as a warning to others, essentially. And
as are the 3 officers who went with him. Yes.
Well, their bodies were quite literally just dragged through the streets. In bits. In bits. And the thing is, on the final bit, like, this was the sort of Lady Sale's contribution to all this, because I guess without her we wouldn't really know exactly what went on in the way it went on. And she basically says that Elphinstone, she says that he had good judgment, but the trouble was he was incredibly indecisive, and he would always be swayed by multiple voices in the room, so to try and sort of appease everyone, but also not take any decisive action.
This is why military leaders don't do councils of war, and anytime you hear a military leader doing a council of war, it almost invariably is a mistake. In the military, do something, don't haver.
No. This reminds me, because in the book The Conduct of War by J.F.C. Fuller, he talks about one of the principles of war, the principle of direction, and that he says a military officer should be like an absolute monarch. They should be like Napoleon. They should be absolute. No one questions them. They give orders, and that's how you fight a war. And I find it really funny.
You can take advice. You can take advice, but you've got to make your own damn mind up.
Yeah.
I also think, like, if you were to occupy Afghanistan like the British were trying to do, you can't really pussyfoot around and sort of not use troops. I think in many ways, you actually, like, if one British soldier is killed, you go around to the villages and you decimate like the population. You even wipe out a couple of towns and villages as an example. You have to really come down heavy on these guys, because this is the sort of language that they understand. You basically have to, go full Alexander on Thebes sort of mentality.
You make the game not worth the candle. But let us be clear about this. The British were not occupying Afghanistan. They were occupying Kabul, Jalalabad, and Kandahar. That's all they were occupying. They occupied 3 towns. And the rest of the country, the Afghans could do what they liked. Now, we will come back to this at the end. And again, I don't want to make this a stream about the recent Afghan war, but we'll do some comparisons at the end of the stream. But yeah, the Brits were in no way occupying Afghanistan. They were occupying a little bit with only a few thousand troops in each place. And they were completely indecisive even then because the British commander was useless. Before we go on, because we've just past the hour mark, I'd just like to say to people, because I'm now spending quite a lot of money for our streaming, guys, if you want to support the channel, you can do so. You can also ask Super Chat questions, which will all get answered towards the end of the stream on our entropy link, which is pinned at the top of the chat. Please also subscribe to the channel, guys. It really does help us, and like the stream. Sorry, guys. Hitman, carry on, mate.
So Monarton's hacked to pieces, and at this point, Elphinstone has to negotiate again with Akbar, this time from an even weaker position, when it's like, okay, you can leave Afghanistan, but you've got to leave some of your officers and civilians behind with us as hostages. You have to hand over some of your treasure and supplies, and we'll also escort you back to your territory. He agrees to this.
This is also, guys, in January. It's in the middle of the winter.
Yeah, and even though Afghanistan is known for being quite hot, because it's very mountainous there, it's very cold in the winter.
Yeah,
and,
the winter is full of snow and ice, and
yeah, and I think this is actually, I think it's one of the worst winters in the area on record, I think, actually, as well, which doesn't help. So, and from there, because the next day, when they set out, Akbar says, I'll meet you at said time to escort you. And when they get ready, he's not there. So they just decide to march on. But as they're marching through the Khyber Pass, these Afghan raiding parties come out and attack them. They snipe at them. They hack them with swords. And this is just the entire journey all the way back to India. It's just being constantly harassed and harangued by these ferocious Afghans until at the very end, when you get to Jalalabad, the British officers who are waiting for the return, there's literally one solitary doctor. He's the only survivor of the retreat through the Khyber Pass, and there's a very famous painting of that scene.
There is. But yeah,
I was going to say that. Sorry, on a side note, the doctor who's in that famous painting was inspired by Watson in Sherlock Holmes, the same sort of character archetype.
No. Conan Doyle was inspired by the painting. It's the other way around.
Oh, sorry. That's what. No, sorry. That's what I meant to say. Sorry. No. So I meant to say that was inspired by the painting. Yeah. Yeah. Is it worth actually bringing up the? Hold on a sec. Is it worth bringing up the Kabul Jalalabad road that was taken? Because even today it is narrow as hell.
Yeah, no, it's a shit road. But the point I would just like us to get onto here a bit is there were about 4,000 fighting British and Indian soldiers at Kabul, but there were probably 15,000 camp followers. So, like, guys who were doing supplies, women and children, many of them Indian women and children, by the way, camels and what have you. And there is no way on God's earth that 4,000 fighting men can defend 15,000 camp followers. It's just not possible. So
no.
When the British general agreed to this retreat, and as Hitman pointed out, he was given all sorts of promises which the Afghans were never going to keep.
I mean, bearing in mind that he treacherously executed McNarton, so he should have known better to trust Akbar.
Yeah, absolutely right. This was never going to work. It was a disaster waiting to happen as soon as they marched out of the cantonments. And there was only one British battalion there, of probably 600 guys. There were a couple of Indian sepoy battalions, but they had already proved less than reliable. I mean, there was a battle earlier on that we haven't talked about, where a British Indian cavalry regiment was ordered to charge the Afghans, and none of the Sowars, none of the Indian cavalry troopers followed their officers, and the British officers charged on their own into the Afghans.
Oh dear, oh dear.
The British officers, you can't slag off their bravery. On their own, they charged into the Afghans, but none of their soldiers followed them. And this was something that happened quite often in this war, that would be repeated in the Anglo-Sikh wars in the later 1840s, where Indian sepoys refused to follow their officers. It first became noticeable in this war.
Was this was this like a East India Company, like just?
Yeah, East India Company cavalry regiment with British officers and Indian soldiers. Yes.
But sorry, what I was saying was this more of a company-wide issue than? Did this happen under the Raj later on, or was this?
No. This happened. It first started being obvious in the Afghan War, and it became fairly common in the Anglo-Sikh wars. So quite often, normally, an Indian Army brigade was 2 Indian regiments and 1 British regiment. And in the Sikh wars, what quite often happened was the British regiment would charge into the Sikh entrenchments, and the Indian soldiers mostly wouldn't. The Gurkhas would, because the Gurkhas are the Gurkhas and they're tough fighters, but the Indian sepoys very often wouldn't. And this became increasingly common in the Anglo-Sikh wars, but the first time we see this happening more than once is in the first Afghan war, when Indian soldiers just didn't follow their British officers. The British officers would say, "Charge, boys," in Indian, and the guys just wouldn't move.
Indians, you can't bloody rely on them.
No, they became very unreliable. And this is something, of course, which never gets spoken about these days, because, if you speak about that, you're being racist somehow. But, whatever. It became common in this war. And so when the British left Kabul to try and march back to Jalalabad, where there was another British garrison, which did actually hold out, with the 13th Somerset Light Infantry, amongst others. Really, the only troops who Ulverston could rely upon was the 44th Regiment, the East Essex Regiment. His Indian sepoys were not really very useful. And like in a retreat, they were even worse,
And it's not like they could, given the opportunity, no doubt they would have run. Did any sepoys ever try and defect or run for the hills? It probably wouldn't have worked, but
I don't think many of them would try and defect in Afghanistan, which was Muslim, and most of those guys were Hindus. But not in Afghanistan. No, I doubt it.
No, it wouldn't have worked. Wouldn't have worked there. The tribes would have just killed them on the spot.
Yeah, they would have killed them anyway because they were Hindus. They hated them more even than they did the British. So
Yeah.
Look at India and Pakistan today, if you like.
Yeah.
But
I'm
they're not exactly pals.
Elphinstone did write, I think, the letter, go back to the 2nd of November. He did write a letter to sorry, what was his name? What was his name? Sorry.
You mean McNaughton?
McNaughton, sorry, yeah, McNaughton. He did write a letter in regards to the disorder in Kabul, and I'll just give you a clue. Elphinstone's character, he just the letter was saying, "Well, we'll see if things are better in the morning," was his response.
Oh dear.
Yeah, it was just like, this will all be cleared. I no doubt this will all be cleared up in the morning.
It'll all be over by Christmas.
Look, guys, I'm repeatedly trying not to get us onto modern things, but I have to answer this question from Novatrix. In the early stages of World War II, the Indian Army did quite well in North Africa, but that was the regular Indian Army. when the Indian Army was expanded during World War II, many of the new units did not do very well in Malaya and Singapore and Burma. They didn't. It's a fact. But as I said, I would much prefer to like make modern talking about the
Well,
common stuff with modern era. I'd like to do that at the end of the stream.
they can see our Kahima, the stream on my channel where we talked about the the Battle of Imphal and Kahima, where we do cover that, that the British and the Indian side of it.
Yeah, I remember doing that. I remember doing that stream of UII. Yeah, that was a pretty interesting stream. But yeah, guys, I'm going to hand it back to Hitman and AI for a minute, just to talk about the retreat, basically at this stage, because there is another bit to this war, which is the Brits send a much better army back into Afghanistan afterwards.
Yes.
But to talk about the retreat, while I go and have a bathroom break, if you don't mind, gents.
Well, I've got not much else to say other than what I've said, but you go ahead.
Oh, I mean, yeah, the 6th of January, officers column slowly moved out of Kabul, which we've already covered here. And yeah, I mean, so Elphinstone said after they realised that there was no promised escort and that there was another act of betrayal, which, if I'm absolutely honest, as you said, it shouldn't have really come as a surprise. I think that was, I mean, his naivety in all of this was is incredible, really. But Elphinstone said that said to the his officers that there'd be no turning back and that they would proceed to Jalalabad, even though, everyone with half a brain present was like, there's snow. We're walking through this narrow pass road. We've got enemy through the Hindu Kush. I mean, this is effectively a suicide run. I think it was on the straight on the second day there was sniping from the surrounding hills. And the trouble was it was constant stopping engagements and then withdraw from by the Afghan tribes. And I mean, just there's a clip, I might share it on Twitter later, but there's a clip of the Soviet-Afghan war. If you want to see sort of that same tactic being used, of just columns of Soviets stopping in convoys, having to fight, getting decimated, and then carrying on. Same sort of thing. And of course, the Afghans was. Sorry, can you continue, Hitman?
Yeah, because we did those pair of streams on Alexander the Great, and of course, when he's marching into Afghanistan, the same thing happens. The Afghans sort of harass the phalanx from the passes and then retreat off. It's very much hit and run, isn't it?
Yes, it is a permanent and they can do it. I mean, again, if you look at the hills and everything, it's very, very easy to do. Especially when you don't know the terrain, and these roads are basically just like kill zones for hostile armies. To be honest,
but one of the things the British learn, and they first learned it in this first Afghan war, with the avenging army that goes in, that we'll talk about in a minute, is that if you're going to advance down an Afghan road, what you have to do is you have to put groups of troops on every high point on either side of the road, so the enemy can't occupy them and fire down at you. And these guys are called pickets. And so eventually, what the British worked out eventually, and every time they fought in Afghanistan or on the northwest frontier, when a British column was advancing down a road, it would start off with a very large advance guard. And from that advance guard, you would send off pickets, which might be a platoon or a company, depending on how big and important the height you were trying to occupy was. And you would occupy that, and then the column would advance down the road, and then that picket would eventually join the rear guard. And that way you could stop the Afghans from doing this tactic. But we only started to work that out in this war.
Yeah.
I think we need to talk a little bit about the 44th Regiment, the East Essex Regiment. As I said, they were the main bit of the British garrison, really, at Kabul, and about 40 of them, with a few guys, officers mostly, from the artillery and cavalry regiments, ended up making the last stand, which is the thumbnail for this stream. By the time they did this, most of them had about 5 rounds of ammunition. And they held off 2 quite big Afghan attacks. And then they ran out of ammunition, and they held off a number of other Afghan attacks with swords and bayonets. And then they were basically all killed. The last survivor, famous painting that we were talking about, is Dr. Bryden, by the way. But he wasn't actually the last survivor. The last survivor was an NCO, a Scottish NCO from the 44th East Essex Regiment, who ended up walking into a British garrison on the Indian border about 3 months later. And he was actually the last survivor. He was dressed as an Indian, and had a really hard time and was nearly starved to death. But he managed to survive, and he walked into a British garrison about 3 months after the fighting.
Yeah. Oh.
But no one made a painting of him, sadly.
Well, I think it's more, you know, it's sort of more dramatic. You have Dr. Brighton, where he arrives on horseback, and then they say, "Where's the army?" He goes, "I am the army. You know, I am what's left of the army, or I am the army."
And Dr. Bryden, by the way, was another of these Irish officers of the British Army, worth mentioning.
Yeah. Yeah, the rear guard was led by Brigadier General John Shelton, who was probably one of the most competent, really, throughout this whole disastrous retreat, to be honest, from what I can see, at least.
Okay, to take this up to the bigger picture again, in the meantime, while all this was going on in Afghanistan, and all this British Army incompetence was going on in Afghanistan, there were big problems in Europe. You had a revolution in France, and you had a French king who was not really a king. And the Russians, of course, the Russian Tsar didn't like this at all. And there was a distinct warming of relations between Britain and Russia at this stage. I don't know if you, Hitman or AI, know much about this.
I think you might have the date wrong, because Louis Philippe wouldn't be overthrown until 1848.
No. It was Louis Philippe who was the problem.
Right, but I don't remember there being a revolution until a few years later.
Hitman, I think what possibly Duke, correct me, is that the king of France at the time adopted more. There was more of a liberal approach, which angered Tsar Nicholas of Russia.
Right. I see.
Because Tsar Nicholas and the king, the French king, were actually quite close friends, but because of the sweeping because of course, remember, in 1848, which you're both right, that was when you had the sort of Europe revolutions around Europe.
No, I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about the liberalization of French policies.
There
was a falling out between the French and Russian monarchs.
That was true, and there was a falling out, and That was one of the reasons why there was a bit of a falling out with Britain and Russia, because of the parliamentary system, which Tsar Nicholas was sort of viewed as a
Yeah, he
too
didn't like,
liberal.
he didn't like the Great Reform Bill, but he thought that the basic Toryism of the Brits would not make this move too quickly, whereas he really went from being pals to detesting the French monarch. And as a result, you had the British and Russian navies cooperating to make life hard for the French. And of course, this also meant that the British government were no longer in favor of anti-Russian policies in Central Asia. This is quite important politically, because this is why everything changed. This is why Britain didn't send a vast army into Afghanistan and occupy the damn place. So yeah, carry on, gents.
Right. So obviously at this point is when so basically Lord Auckland is so embarrassed by what happens that he's forced to resign as the Governor General, and this is when Ellenborough comes in, and Ellenborough wants a punitive expedition, so he organises a new army under two generals, which are called
Pollock and Sale, I believe.
Yes, that's it. Sorry, Pollock and Knott. Sorry, Pollock and Knott.
Pollock and Knott. I beg your pardon, mate.
Yeah. And so at this point, because Shah Shuja has been killed, but his son Futek is still around, so they're like, right, let's try this again, and they invade to put Futek on the throne. And so they carve a path back to Kabul. They put Futek on the throne, and they tear down Kabul's bazaar where McNaughton's body parts have been displayed. They kill several Afghans and rape a few of them just to, restore order and send a message.
I'm not. Hang on. I am not sure about the rapes. That may or may not have happened. I hear people claiming that. I don't see much evidence for it, to be honest. But, okay.
That sounds a bit. That does sound like against sort of like the British sort of way of doing it at the time. It's also worth noting that the Governor General, Lord Auckland, apparently suffered a stroke upon hearing the news of the annihilation of the Kabul expedition. So
perhaps he was having a bit of a Augustus moment. Elphinstone, give me back my regiments.
Yeah, yes. I don't understand this, given the British forces in Afghanistan were pathetic at the beginning of 1842. I mean, they were pathetic.
I think the East India Company were more afraid that if there was a perceived, it's not so much the reality, but if the news gets out that a British force was completely wiped out by some hill tribes, it may encourage the principalities at home to rise up and effectively like an Indian rebellion. I think when you read around the East India Company stuff, there's always that perennial worry of an Indian rebellion occurring in some form.
Oh yeah, there were so few British soldiers in India. And of course,
I think that's why they were so. I think that's why there was so much, and why you had this army of retribution led by George Pollock and William Knott and Robert Sale. I mean, let's be honest. The reason why they sacked Kabul and killed and did all this symbolic, this symbolic retribution, I think was, as Hitman said, to just drive a point home that Britain will not be defeated, and that we will, if you strike us, we will hit back 10 times harder, sort of thing, which is perfectly reasonable as a power to do, because you don't project weakness.
I totally agree. The thing that gets me is I hear these rumors that the Brits did rape, but I've never seen any actual proof they did. I mean, I'm not saying that no British soldier ever raped some Afghan chick, because, armies get shitbags in them, they do, but it was never British policy. And to be honest with you, of all the armies in the world, the British probably have the best reputation for not doing that, to be honest.
Well, that's my point. I'm not saying it was policy. I'm just saying I think there was a lot of anger at what happened, and yeah, let's just say the passions were running high.
Maybe. I think a lot of that is modern leftist bollocks, but you know, it's just me. I like I said, I'm not saying it never happened, but did it happen in a significant number of cases? Probably not.
Well, not significant. It was probably mostly just murders and maybe a few rapes. Not, but whatever.
I'm sure there were murders.
I'm actually looking at the British sacking of Kabul. I've just got up like a sort of list of I mean, there seems to be like a lot of there still seem to be a looting. Like looting was sort of sanctioned in this.
Oh, looting would be fine. Yeah, armies were allowed to loot. You did
looting
that.
was sanctioned in this.
Yeah.
So that did happen. When it comes to the rape stuff, I mean, it is mentioned, but there is no. A lot of them have sources, like from diary entries. I can't find any sources on the rape stuff, though. That's
No, I can never do that myself, and I have looked. This is the thing: you get this, but you never hear it. But
hold on.
Hang on, AI.
No, sorry.
Wait a minute. But you also get. Oh, the Afghans killed all the women and children in this place, but they never even mention anything about rape because right.
I mean the rape angle comes from I think the Afghan side account. So I don't know.
Surprise.
I don't know, but I mean either way, I guess the Army of Retribution, as it's been sort of coined, did achieve its objective of sort of a revenge attack. Revenge raid.
They marched anywhere they wanted in Afghanistan and won, and then we withdrew very sensibly. Although
yes,
we would repeat the insanity again in 1878, and again in 2000. So.
Well, it's also worth mentioning that one of the reasons the Army of Retribution is able to do this is that a lot of the tribes have actually rebelled against Akbar at this point. So it's kind of like civil war mode, and so that's why there's this opening to come in and just put on this grand display of might. And the army withdraws at this point, leaving Futa in charge, but he gets deposed and killed, and then Dost Muhammad is just allowed to come back, and he's the emir again. And so what a waste of time that all was.
Well, except for the fact that for the rest of Dost Muhammad's life, and he lived quite a long time, there was never another Russian envoy in Kabul. We have to say that.
He dies in 1863, so he ruled another 20 years or so.
Yeah, there was. He would never accept any Russian envoy, and the Russians did offer, and he just said no because he didn't want the Brits to invade him again. So
a very stern warning.
But it was a disaster for the Brits. It was a very foolish war. It was a stupid war. It gained us nothing. The only thing I can say is it only lasted 4 years, whereas the last Afghan war lasted 20. So maybe people in the mid 19th century were more intelligent than they are today. But I mean, we can talk about this now if you'd like, because we've covered the war and we can now talk about the similarities.
Well, we propped up a corrupt, illegitimate regime that none of the tribes really liked.
That's
and
pretty much the same.
And when we had our backsides handed to us, along with the other like Americans and Allied forces, we retreated like cowards, and many American soldiers and British soldiers were either killed or injured by some form of reprisals attacks by not just adjacent groups in Afghanistan. What did we do? Did we do any revenge raid or sack and burn the city? Or no, we didn't do that. We just we had a spray paint memorial of George Floyd. throughout
Yeah,
Kabul.
that would have been
wonderful.
so popular in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
But I mean,
and
look, we all had British and American soldiers, from privates to NCOs to junior officers, who pointed out to their superiors, as I say, British soldiers and American soldiers, and probably Canadians too, because the Canadians lost the third largest number of men in Afghanistan after America and Britain, pointed out to their superiors, look, gentlemen, this local Afghan governor we're supposed to be supporting has 11, 12, and 13-year-old boys who he is abusing, shall we say, because we're on YouTube. And they were told by their senior officers, the Americans, the Brits, and everybody else were told, we don't want to know, ignore it.
I don't usually recommend Vice because it's you know, a machine of crap. But back in the day when they did produce the odd one or two interesting documentaries, you can find an old one where it shows British and American forces officers training up the Afghan National Army, and basically they are just spastics with guns. Quite frankly, there is nothing. I mean, they most of them were more interested on getting high on opium. The Brit, I think one of the American officers walked into this fortification outside this town, and everyone was just high on opium. And then one guy was playing cricket with the butt of his AK-47. I mean, it was a total farce that what they created, and then when they'd go out on patrol to show off to the camera, they would unload on random buildings and with their AK-47s and even RPG rockets, just to sort of to show off that they're taking the fight to the Taliban. And there was this really one funny bit where the journalist who was following around went, they were talking to this village elder, and the elder was like trying to negotiate, and he asked the elder, why didn't you give like the Afghan National Army everything? Why did you have to negotiate like this settlement of, I think, what houses they could stay in for the night or something down? And he goes, well, when you guys leave, do you think these clowns are going to govern Afghanistan?
Yeah,
that was it.
fair enough.
That was it. So you can find that documentary on YouTube. You can sort of see, and also another documentary that I mentioned as well, Hitman. If you Bitter Lake, which is an Adam Curtis documentary on a particular project. It's a I think it's like a hydroelectric dam, or just a dam project in Afghanistan that was propped up by American and British forces. Total disaster, like most things, infrastructure project. And it showed a clip of I believe it showed a clip in Helmand or Kandahar province of British soldiers camping out at this old fort on top of this this sort of hill, and it was an old British fort from the 19th century, and it was just really it was just sort of sort of interesting sort of juxtaposition of the sort of forever. I think Anne Curtis even sort of referred to it as like this never-ending conflict, and I don't know. I kind of wish that he sort of read the sort of Kipling poem out over those sorts of clips, because I think that would have been more appropriate. But yeah,
I do remember a documentary on YouTube you can find of a British unit that goes to the Maiwand battlefield from the Second Afghan War, which was a disaster, and incidentally was largely a disaster because the two Indian regiments with the British battalion ran away, and the Royal Berkshires ended up fighting 20,000 Afghans on their own.
yeah.
But
I will say though, with the British in Afghanistan recently, I have to say given what was presented for the average soldier, I think the British had the most shit thrown at them, because Helmand Province was the birthplace of the Taliban, and just south in Pakistan was, that sort of Helmand, and that part of Pakistan was the sort of nexus, the center of
But
Taliban.
why did we? AI. Look, my point is this. I think the Afghan war was a waste of time. I think
Yeah, it was a massive waste of time.
No, let me finish. I
Sorry.
think we should have gone in there with the SAS and the SBS as we did at the beginning to help the American Special Forces piss off the Taliban. Fair enough. But why occupy the damn place for 20 years? And if you are going to occupy the place for 20 years, why do you only send a brigade group, which is what Britain put there? A brigade group. It was a slightly reinforced brigade of 3 battalions, and the fucking Royal Marines, right, who only have 3 Royal Marine commandos, and in fact now only 2.5, but then 3, managed to keep a battalion group there for the whole time. But even so, that's 4 basic infantry fighting battalions to occupy a whole province, and we couldn't do it. And the only reason the British survived in Helmand Province at all was because eventually the US Marines were sent to reinforce us, because there were just not enough British soldiers there to do it. You can't hold a whole province with 4,000 people. You just can't.
No, well, that was just the incompetence of the British state, because many people in the Foreign Office and in the government at the time didn't even know about the previous Afghan. They didn't know about Afghanistan at all, or the fact that this was
we had fought 3 wars there: 1838 to 42, 1878 to 1880,
New Labour.
and 1990, and we did not understand anything about Afghanistan, even though Britain had spent years fighting in Afghanistan in the 19th and early 20th century.
Well, yeah, this was the product of the New Labour government. They knew jack shit. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when we went into Afghanistan, most of you see the northern states and provinces, most of those northern provinces didn't even have any Taliban presence there. I mean, yeah, they were tribal, but as soon as we left, every state province had a Taliban network, which was basically the governing body waiting in the wings, which is what we saw. That's how quickly Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. So, I mean, in many ways, the Taliban only really exists because of the occupation and because of the war.
Well, I mean, basically what Britain, America, and other nations did for the last 20 years was train the Taliban how to fight a Western force and still survive.
And leave them a shit ton of weapons and equipment.
Yeah. It was so bad that the British War Memorial had to be shipped back to Britain because we knew it would be destroyed if we left it there. You see, I'm one of these people who thinks that Sir, in air quotes, Tony Blair should be arraigned as a war criminal, but I don't think he should be arraigned as a war criminal for killing people like Afghans or Iraqis. He should be arraigned as a war criminal for killing almost 600 British soldiers and maiming and wounding many thousands more for no purpose whatsoever.
I know on this stream we've been sort of ripping on Elphinstone for his sort of dithering and incompetence, but I will say at least Elphinstone knew it was a hopeless position, and yes, it was ridiculous for him to, and the actions he took and everything, but he in his more dithering way knew that the situation wasn't tenable, that they couldn't there wasn't a route out apart from just
No.
a retreat. Now, yeah, the retreat was a disaster in and of
Well, the
itself.
retreat was stupid. He should have stayed where he was, but I mean, and got
Yeah, he should.
and occupied the Bala Hills. That was his only option, really.
Yeah, sort of bunker down a bit. But the thing is, like, as people it just reminded me, the weapons equipment that was left recently. What was it? General Milley of the United States said it would be it'd actually be that was the cheaper option to actually bring them to sort of take them away, all the vehicles, all the helicopters, even the few jets and the guns and all that, and the weapons and the artillery pieces and mortars. Leaving them there was the cheaper option.
But don't go away with the idea that somehow Britain was better than America. Britain just ran away earlier, basically, from the last Afghan war.
Well, we didn't even in Helmand province, the bases that were there were still left intact. They weren't when the Taliban walked in there. They were still left intact, and there were guns and weapons still there from the. I think to be fair,
not many, but
they were from the Afghan National Army. So to be fair, they were used by Afghan National Army, but the bases were still present. I mean, we should have destroyed those bases. We would have torched those bases, but
we shouldn't have occupied them in the first place.
Well, we shouldn't have occupied them in the first place. Yeah.
But yeah, I think Hitman, what's your thinking about history repeating itself?
Well, it's tragic, but I think the lesson is with Afghanistan. If they're going to fight a war there, have a clear objective in mind, go in, achieve it, and then just fucking leave.
100%. 100%.
Also, I mean, people like Rory Stewart, because I know he's done there was like a series of him, or maybe a book like talking about going around Afghanistan or something. He has there is this really bizarre like British shit lib obsession with Afghanistan with these sort of barbaric tribal people. There's this sort of bizarre fascination with them, and I don't quite get it. Like, do they want to try and conquer them? Is it like the last frontier or something? I mean, Hitman, do you know what? Do you understand what I mean?
Well, it's very interesting.
Carry on, Hitman.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that, because a very famous quote of William Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, where he said something that like a British subject has the same rights and equality as the Afghan tribesman, and I can't help but feeling that's where this is all coming from.
Yep, 100%, mate. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen the documentary, which I think is still on YouTube, of this British feminist woman trying to teach Afghan girls of about 15 about the patriarchy, which apparently
I've seen that. Yeah,
the British government paid for.
Oh no, the actual story, because you mentioned Rory Stewart AI, but one of the stories about all the USAID cuts is that one of the things that USAID were funding was funding Rory Stewart's wife for teaching girls in Afghanistan.
Oh God! And you can imagine Rory Stewart's wife almost certainly has a big strap on. But anyway.
Oh dear.
I'm pretty certain about that.
I heard about that. Yes, teaching again, sort of indoctrinating. I tell you what, making the Afghans hate the West even more than they did before. Yeah.
To quote unquote, this is why the terrorists hate us.
And let's not also remember, before we finish, that under the American rule that the British and everyone else supported in Afghanistan, Afghanistan made more opium than it ever has in its history. And again, our soldiers were told to ignore it.
There's some spooky Iron Dukes. There was a lot of spooky stuff going on the ground.
Yeah,
spooky
nothing
stuff.
to do with the CIA and MI6, of course, but yes.
Yeah.
Well, we wouldn't be opposed to opium production if you know what's going on with the Chinese at this time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
'Cause, I
but that
mean,
was that was for based reasons, though, Hitman. That wasn't for cringe, gay, liberal reasons. It's for base reasons.
of course, because because the first Opium War was contemporaneous with the first Afghan War. Funnily enough, I know, let's invade Afghanistan so we can seize their opium, so we can sell it to the Chinese.
I mean, to be honest,
not
I'd rather
a
be
bad
selling
idea.
it.
If we could do that today, I'd kind of support it.
But
I mean,
you know, saying that's why there's a fentanyl crisis in the United States. It's because the Chinese blame the West for the opium war, so they just want to flood America with drugs because it's like, yeah, we're gonna do
revenge.
to you what you did to us. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but America's got the opium crisis from America is also. I mean, well, allegedly, there's that's a whole different stream and topic. But that it was a lot of it's instigated by the CIA and the agencies at home. For other reasons. So it's kind of like, well, yeah, we did against the Chinese population, but it's like if we did against the British population, that would be, that's sort of unacceptable. But if you're doing it against a foreign power for geopolitical reasons, I can understand it, and
According to Atterman, the empire sold more opium domestically per capita
which
than
it
China.
did. Which it did. I know that Adam has done some research on this, and the opium wars, in air quotes, are vastly exaggerated these days, and he is right about that. Because I did check up on it, and Adam has looked into it, and he is correct. I mean, these days, of course, it's popular to say that, but it's the same thing as reparations for slavery or anything else anti-white and Western you can come out with, basically.
isn't it just because the Chinese are angry because that's how we got Hong Kong?
But that's not how we got Hong Kong. We got Hong Kong by beating their army, but never mind. We may even come on to the British conquest of Hong Kong on this stream at some point. But yeah, it's disappointing to me that even right-wing guys like AI here, to some degree, believe this anti-British bullshit which is pushed all the time. But whatever.
What's that? What's that?
Well, to some degree, you believe we got Hong Kong because of the Opium War. I don't understand what you mean.
No, that's what the Chinese believe, that because of the opium. No, you're missing.
Oh, the Chinese believe. Oh, the Chinese believe it. Yeah, the Chinese claim to believe it.
Every Chinese article or Chinese commentator, like when you see the Oxford Union. So what I was trying to say was
Oxford Union in Britain. That's Chinese.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. They will say the British instigated the opium wars to get Hong Kong. That's basically what they believe. That's what most.
It may well be, but they weren't the Opium Wars. They were the anti-China wars. But okay.
Yeah. I know it was two different events, but that's what I was saying. The Chinese believe the national shame is that that's how we got Hong Kong.
The national shame was that the Chinese couldn't fight. But anyway, never mind.
Well,
But yeah, I do look. We're getting a bit off subject. Any final thoughts, Hitman?
Well, first Afghan war, kind of a waste of time. Other than Dost Mohammed ended up doing what we wanted, which is acting as an ally and a buffer against the Russian threat. So perhaps we gained something, but it came at a cost and a lot of embarrassment.
100%. Don't disagree with any of that. And a lot of dead British soldiers. They're good British soldiers as well too. The 44th East Essex Regiment were a fine battalion. It was a pity they were destroyed.
Very sad.
AI, any final thoughts?
I mean, legacy wise, we got a we got like the Flashman fiction from it. We also got the there was a children's novel by G.A. Henty's, the To Herat and Kabul. So there is I think it's I think it just serves as a reminder, really, of just how the indecisiveness, incompetent leadership, and also at the time it did. I think at the time, maybe for or the subsequent events, did sort of jolt the East India Company out of maybe more of a relaxed state when it comes to this sort of sense of untouchable, thing sort of about them.
Well,
I think it focused minds.
we will in due course talk about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, which started in 1845, and then we will eventually get on to the Indian Mutiny of 1857. So yeah, we'll talk about that stuff in due course. Would you like to plug anything, Hitman, like your channel and your recent excellent stream with Apostolic Majesty on the Great Game, which this stream is kind of part of?
Yeah, so yesterday I had Apostolic Majesty on. We discussed the Great Game, the Anglo-Russian rivalry in the 19th century. So if you want some more context on the history of this period, then I strongly suggest you give that a watch. I also do a stream on my channel every Tuesday, the archival discourses, so give that a watch as well. And I recently launched channel membership, so if you want to support my work, please consider becoming a channel member.
Yep, and Hitman's channel will be putting a pinned comment under the stream later on. AI, anything you would like to plug, mate?
Yeah, my channel, AI Homelander, and gonna try and do a few streams soon. Been a bit busy with work and everything else at home, so but I'm also got something else planned in the mix with a few other friends online. It's very early stages, but I can't announce anything at the moment. But when I do, I will make sure I'll announce it on your show first, Iron Duke. I think that would be fair.
Well, we'll look forward to that, AI, and of course, AI's stream will be linked in a pinned comment under the channel later on. I would say to people who are watching us, do come back on the same time as this evening, 9 p.m. on Saturday. Do come back and watch the normal Splendid Isolation stream, which looks at current events, news, and politics from a British and old Commonwealth point of view. And there is a number of interesting subjects this week. Everything from Cummings coming out supporting reform, which I'm happy to see, to the same black judge who ruled against Britain in the UN about the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean, now saying Britain owes various Caribbean nations £18 trillion. And of course, he has no way to enforce this. But the thing is, really anti-British people like Starmer and Lammy, who are also really dumb, might possibly even support this. And we'll also be talking about the British increase in defence spending, which is actually mostly going to go to Mauritius for taking over territory which is already British, which if you were not the Mad Hatter, would make you insane. But anyway, that's what Starmer and Lammy are doing. And of course, Lammy isn't British. He doesn't regard himself as British. And Starmer is one of those British people who hate being British. So yeah, all of that is true. Patriotic Archive is in the chat. He's a friend of the channel, and I'm going to play us out with one of his tunes. It's not about the first Afghan war, it's about the second Afghan war, but we'll cover that at some stage too.
Kabul towns by Kabul River, blow the trumpet, draw the sword. There I left me mate forever, wet and dripping. Takes me sergeant and the Kabul River in the dark. Kabul town is sun and dust. Blow the trumpet, draw the sword. I'd as soon have left it first, instead of him beside the ford. Ford, ford, ford the Kabul River, ford the Kabul River in the dark. You can hear the horses thrashing, you can hear the men a splashing. Cross the ford of Kabul River in the dark. Kabul town was ours to take. Blow the trumpet, draw the sword. I'd have left it for his sake, him that left me by the ford. Ford, ford, ford the Kabul River, ford the Kabul. It's none too bloomin' dry there. Ain't you never coming nigh there? Cross the ford of Kabul River in the dark. Kabul town can go to hell. Blow the trumpet, draw the sword. For I see him live and well, him the best beside the ford. Ford, ford, ford the Kabul River, ford the Kabul River in the dark. God help 'em if they blunder, for their boots will pull 'em under. By the ford of Kabul River in the dark. Turn your horse from Kabul town, blow the trumpet, draw the sword. Him and half me mates is down, down and drowned by the ford. Ford, ford, ford the Kabul River, ford the Kabul River in the dark. There's that river low and falling, but it ain't no use of calling. Cross the ford the Kabul River in the dark.
That was from the excellent Patriotic Archive channel on YouTube. Go and check him out. He's got some great music. Thank you very much to my guests this evening, Hitman and AI. Pleasure always to stream with you guys. We will be back on Saturday with our normal Splendid Isolation stream, and we will look at the very strange things that are going on at the moment in the world from a British and old Commonwealth point of view. Thanks for joining us this evening. Let me just quickly check that we don't have anything on entropy, which we do not. What a surprise. So yeah, do join us, guys, on Saturday. We're living through interesting times, I would say, but I have not given up hope for Great Britain. I think we might still come back from this with a bit of luck. Go on, don't let the bastards grind you down.
Go well, everyone.